Hello and welcome to another session on advanced contracts. Today's session, we would be dealing with the topic writ reliefs in government contracts. In this entire session, we would understand what is a writ, what is a government contract, what are the kinds of writ reliefs, and why are writ reliefs important specifically in government contracts. Now, as we move ahead, we would understand why writ jurisdiction is required in government contracts. First of all, we need to understand that every contract that the government enters into is entered on behalf of the public. Now, all these contracts, whether it is for the building of roads, for bridges, hospitals, or for any other purpose, it is for the welfare of the society at large. Now, in order to ensure that all these contracts that are entered by the government, they are fair, they are free from an element of any kind of arbitrariness and without an element of bias involved in it, a writ remedy becomes crucial and important. Because every contract that is entered, it must be absolutely fair from any kind of leniency to any particular individual or a group. Therefore, in order to ensure that the contracts entered by the government is fair and to ensure that all these steps have been followed in that contract, and if suppose there is an element of biasness involved in it, or the contract entered wasn't through fair means and unfair means were used, the invocation of writ remedies become crucial under Article 226 and Article 32 of the Constitution respectively. Now, Article 226 relates to the jurisdiction of the High Court and Article 32 relates to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. We would be dealing with Article 226 and 32 in the slides going further ahead. Now, in order to understand a government contract, it is very essential for us to understand that what actually is a government entity. And to our surprise, the Board of Cricket Control in India, the BCCI, interestingly, is not a government entity. Now, BCCI, just for everyone's knowledge, is the richest cricket board in the entire world. It is richer than the International Cricket Covenant as well, the ICC. Now, why is this not a government entity? The Supreme Court, in its landmark judgment, while stating that BCCI is not a government entity, it stated that BCCI is not financially, functionally, or administratively dominated by government, nor it is under the control of the government, and therefore it is not a state. Now, why did the court use the term state and not a government entity? Now, in order to understand why the court used the word state and not government entity, we need to look into Article 12 of the Constitution. Now, this brings us to the most important question, that BCCI is not a government entity. Why? Because it doesn't relate its function to the government. It is a private body that is not financially or functionally or administratively dominated by the government, nor is under the control of the government. That means the government does not has any say over the working of the Board of Cricket Control for cricket in India. Now, BCCI is free to conduct its own charter, its own constitution in order to ensure its functioning. Now, therefore, we need to understand why did the court not use the term government entity in its ruling and instead use the term state. Now, central government and state governments, are these only considered states or is there anything more to it? Let's understand it in more detail. Now, understanding Article 12 of the Indian Constitution. Now, Article 12 of the Constitution states as such, Article 12 is defined that unless otherwise it requires, the state includes the government and Parliament of India and the government and the legislature of each of the states and all local or other authorities within the territory of India or under the control of the government of India. Now, what does this mean? That when it says that the state will include the government and the parliament and the government and the legislature of each states and all local authorities and other authorities as and when required or under the control of the government of India. Now, Article 12 is that article of the Constitution that goes on to explain what actually is the meaning of state. Now, as we just read, every government in every state will be considered as part of Article 12. Every legislature, every legislative council in each state will also be considered under Article 12. Now, Article 12 also uses the word local authorities. Now, when we say local authorities, that means the municipal corporations, other bodies such as the PWT, the Public Works Department. All these authorities are under the control of the government of India, the central government or the state government by somehow and the other. And therefore, they are considered as a government entity. Therefore, in order to understand Article 12, we need to understand that an entity that is funded by the government or that is functionally under the aegis of the government or takes its command from the state government or the central government will be a state and eventually a government entity. And any of these entities, if they enter into a contract, that would be a government contract. Now, it is not defined to government departments and legislatures. By defined, I mean that government departments and legislatures are not the only entities that will be considered as state under Article 12, but it extends to the administrative, judicial or quasi-judicial folds that violate fundamental rights of individuals. Now, in our constitution, there are fundamental rights that is guaranteed to every citizen in India. Now, administrative bodies such as IAS officers, the district magistrate or the collector, even they would come under the purview of Article 12. Judicial or quasi-judicial bodies, for example, the consumer redressal forums, they will also be considered as state under Article 12. Now, State Bank of India is a government entity as per Article 12 because it is under the aegis of the government of India. A children aid society will also come under Article 12. However, a cooperative society will not come under Article 12. And the reason a cooperative society will not come under Article 12 is because it is not financed or governed by the state or the central government. A cooperative society is a coming together of different residents in a society, and for the welfare of the society, they come up with a cooperative in order to ensure that the living in the society happens in a proper and ambient manner. Now, interestingly, United Nations being a global body also does not come under Article 12. And the reason the United Nations does not come under Article 12 is because it is not financially or functionally dependent on the government of India or the government of any of the Indian states or the union territories. Now, this brings us to one of the most important principles, that is, how do we determine what is a government entity and against whom will a writ remedy actually lie? Now, there are around 6 to 7 principles that have been incorporated by our honorable courts in order to understand that against which entity a writ remedy will lie. Justice Bhagwati, around the year 1980 and 1981, in the landmark judgment of Ajay Hasya versus Khalid Mujib's case, enshrine the principles under which we can understand that what are the important and crucial factors that we need to understand in order to decide that whether a writ remedy will lie against that particular entity or not. The first is the entire share capital of the corporation is held by the government. That means a body that is completely financed by the government. Against such a body, a writ remedy will definitely lie. For example, the Defense Research and Development Organization. It is a body whose entire share capital is held with the government, and therefore against organizations like the DRDO or other state entities, against these corporations, a writ remedy will definitely lie. Second principle, a financial assistance is almost meeting the entire expenditure of that corporation. Now, in order to ensure that a writ remedy lies against this, it needs to be understood that an institute or an organization who is partly or more than partly assisted by the government in terms of finances to meet their expenses, for instance, the JNU, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, or the Indian Oil Corporation, all these entities, they enjoy financial assistance from the government, and therefore a writ remedy will lie against them. The third principle that was enshrined by Honorable Justice Bhagwati was the corporation enjoys monopoly statutes in the particular sector. For example, the Indian Oil Corporation. The Indian Oil Corporation enjoys a monopoly in the petroleum sector. In the crude oil sector, it enjoys a major monopoly. Then ISRO enjoys a monopoly in the space sector in India. So all these sectors, they have a monopoly in their particular sector, and they are also financed by the Indian government, either wholly or partly, and therefore a writ remedy will lie. Now, the next principle that was enshrined, a deep-rooted state or government control. For example, all the municipal councils, the municipal corporations in all the states across India, they have a deep-rooted state control within them. And therefore, all these entities will also be liable to a writ remedy if they enter into a government contract that is of an unfair nature. Now, the fifth principle that was enshrined was the functions of this entity is closely related to the government functions. Now, there are some entities, for example, the water department in our state. So, their work is to ensure that a proper and a safe drinking water is provided to every household. Now, in order to ensure this responsibility, they are categorizing and they are implementing a duty, a function of the state, and therefore a writ remedy will also lie against them. And the last principle that was enshrined was if an arm of the government is transferred to a corporation, for example, the Delhi Transport Corporation or the Karnataka Transport Association, all these functions are government functions that has been transferred to a private entity or a semi-private entity in order to ensure that they run the business. For example, in Meghalaya, there is the MTDC, the Meghalaya State Transport Corporation and the Meghalaya Tourism Corporation. So these corporations, they are actually carrying out a duty of the government. The government has given them a duty that you ensure that the transport department in the state is run by you. The tourism at major attractions or in smaller attractions, you build a hotel and then earn revenue out of it. So this entire tourism arm of the government is transferred from the government's deep-rooted handle to a private or a semi-private entity. And therefore, if any of the 6 criterias, if either or even one of the criterias are met, a writ remedy will lie against the government or against such a corporation who is indulging in any one of the activities if they fall in one of the 6 categories.